Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are getting into something huge, a topic that's, really shaping this century.
Mm.
China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. And specifically, that really loaded term you hear everywhere, debt trap diplomacy.
It's a term that gets thrown around a lot.
It really does. And for you listening, our mission here is to get past that simple back and forth. Is it generous aid or is it just cynical exploitation? Because the reality is so much more interesting.
It absolutely is. And to really cut through the noise, we're going to use two powerful academic tools today.
Okay.
First, Wallerstein's world systems theory, which is all about the global economic hierarchy. And second, we'll use deconstruction Derrida's idea, which is perfect for finding the hidden contradictions in, the big stories that powerful countries tell about themselves.
So we're not just looking at what China is doing, but how the whole game of global power might be changing.
Or, and this is the crucial part, how it might be staying exactly the same.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with world systems theory, or WST. For anyone who needs a quick refresher, it basically maps the world into three tiers.
Right. You have the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery.
The core being the established economic powers, the West, historically.
Hmm.
The periphery are the countries that mostly export raw materials.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that middle zone, the semi-periphery.
Mm-hmm.
So the big question to start us off is, where does China fit into all this? What is the BRI really about from that structural point of view?
WST gives us a really clear lens here. It sees the BRI not as some simple aid project, but as a classic strategy by a semi-periphery power that is making a very aggressive push to transition into the core.
So it's a power play.
It's a massive structural power play. It's designed to literally reshape global trade routes, financial flows, everything to its own benefit. It's a bid to become the next hegemon.
And the way they're doing it is so different from what we've seen for, the last 70 years, which is why it's so controversial. Think about the old Western model. From the core, you had the IMF, the World Bank. They gave you loans, but with a lot of strings attached.
Very visible strings.
Right. They demanded structural adjustments. You had to agree to democratization, privatize industries, things like that. The political agenda was right there on the surface.
Whereas the Chinese model comes in with this very appealing message of non-interference. They say, we don't care about your internal politics. They focus on these huge infrastructure, loans, ports, railways, and they offer it as unconditional financing. But, and this is the key, the difference isn't just what they fund, but how they're positioning their power.
Okay, and that's where it gets really interesting. Because the second you hear a great power say the word unconditional, you have to be skeptical.
That's where deconstruction comes in.
Exactly. That claim of unconditional aid, is it real?
The analysis says a hard no. What the source material shows is that China's financing just has a totally different kind of conditionality.
So not the political conditions of the West.
Right. These are commercial and strategic conditions that are baked right into the loan agreements themselves.
So we've just swapped one set of rules for another. What kind of rules are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, the mandatory use of Chinese construction companies and even Chinese labor. So a huge chunk of the loan money immediately flows right back to China's state-owned firms.
Ah, okay.
Then there's the push for loans to be denominated in yuan, which helps internationalize their currency. But the biggest one, the most critical, is the requirement to collateralize strategic national assets.
You mean things like ports and mines?
Exactly. We're talking deep water ports, crucial mines, the national power grid, assets with huge strategic value.
And this is where it all gets a bit murky, isn't it? The sources mention secret clauses in these agreements. I think they cited Sri Lanka and Kenya.
Precisely. So that claim of being unconditional, it just deconstructs itself. It falls apart. The absence of Western-style political conditions just hides a different and maybe even more binding set of commercial conditions.
It's not no conditions, it's our condition.
Yeah, it's a substitution.
Okay, that makes total sense. And that connects directly to the second big contradiction, right? The whole aid versus exploitation debate. China sells this with a narrative of South cooperation and win-win, while critics immediately jump to calling it neo-colonialism.
And the case studies are where you see just how blurry that line gets.
Let's talk about the most famous example, Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. China gives them a $1.1 billion loan.
Right.
The project flounders, Sri Lanka can't pay, and in the end, China takes control of the port on a 99-year lease. So for you listening, was that development aid, or was it a strategic takeover from the very beginning?
And you see a similar pattern with natural resources. Take Zambia, for instance.
The copper mines.
Yes, the copper
Yeah.
mines. The debt load there has led directly to the transfer of rights over some of their most valuable mineral assets. The so-called development partnership very quickly starts to look like resource extraction.
So the key takeaway here is that both things are happening at once.
Exactly. The projects do build real infrastructure. That's the aid part. You can't deny that.
Yeah.
But the long-term control and the transfer of value, well, that's a form of exploitation. They aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same coin.
Which brings us to the third point, which is about sovereignty. China's official policy is all about respecting national sovereignty.
It's the bedrock of their foreign policy rhetoric.
But the debt mechanism seems to do the exact opposite. It erodes sovereignty, but from the inside.
We call this a shift from classic colonialism to something like financial occupation.
Financial occupation, I like that.
In the old days, occupation was military, boots on the ground. Today, a country's sovereignty is protected by international law. It's legally intact. But factually, it's been hollowed out by debt.
Can you give us a concrete example of that?
Sure, look at Djibouti. It has an enormous debt load to China, and it's also home to China's first overseas military base. That combination severely restricts Djibouti's foreign policy options. They can't afford to upset their main creditor.
And the sheer numbers, the impact on a national budget, must be crippling.
The figures from Kenya are just staggering. The repayment for their standard gauge railway, a $3.2 billion loan, eats up something like 5% of the entire country's GDP every year.
5%.
When that much of your national budget is just gone, just to service one debt, your political sovereignty, your freedom to choose, becomes, well, pretty theoretical.
Okay, so let's pull the lens back out. Back to the big world systems theory question. Is China building a new, different kind of global system, or is it just trying to become the new boss of the same old system?
The analysis in our sources leans very heavily toward the second option. The argument is that China is largely reproducing the exact same capitalist system logic we've seen for centuries.
Just with a new headquarters in Beijing instead of Washington?
Pretty much. You see the same core mechanics at play, things like surplus value transfer.
Can you quickly break down what surplus value transfer means in this context for, our listeners?
Sure. It's basically the process where the economic value created in the periphery from raw materials, cheap labor gets funneled up the chain to the core. For decades, that value flowed west. Now, a huge portion of it is flowing to China.
So the game is the same. Unequal exchange. China exports high-value goods, imports raw materials, and it's all built on debt as the primary tool of control.
Exactly. It follows Wallerstein's argument perfectly. The capitalist world system stays constant. It's just the hegemon at the top that changes. It went from Spain to the UK to the US, and the question now is China next?
But it's not a simple copy-paste, is it? The sources call it a contradictory transformation. There's continuity, sure, but there's also a rupture, a real break with the past.
And that rupture is huge. It's the rise of real multipolarity. It's the success of a state capitalist model on a global scale. It's the first time a non-Western power has mounted such a credible challenge. So the game might be the same, but the players and the rules are definitely changing.
And China's strategy isn't flawless. It has its own internal problems, right? Sources talk about a sustainability paradox.
They do. It's a real catch-22 for Beijing. They need these countries to be economically successful enough to pay back the loans.
Always.
But at the same time, the model depends on them remaining in debt for strategic control. So you get the self-sabotaging dynamic. If a country defaults, the trap snaps shut on the lender too.
Have we seen that happen?
We have. Post-2020, China had to restructure major loans for countries like Angola and Ethiopia because they were on the verge of collapse, which would have meant China losing everything.
And that must lead to a legitimacy crisis.
It does. The debt trap narrative, whether you think it's fair or not, has become a powerful diplomatic weapon against China. It hurts their soft power.
And we've seen countries pull out, right?
Absolutely. Malaysia canceled projects, and just recently Italy officially withdrew from the BRI. The win-win story is getting harder to sell.
So the final deconstruction here, and for me this is the most fascinating part, is that the countries in the so-called periphery, they aren't just helpless victims.
No, far from it. They are strategic actors in their own right. This completely breaks that simple victim and perpetrator story.
Let's go back to Sri Lanka. The sources say the government there actually used the debt trap narrative for its own purposes.
They did. They used it as a political scapegoat to cover for their own terrible fiscal mismanagement. It was a convenient way to deflect blame onto an outside power.
And others are playing a more direct strategic game.
A double game, precisely. Countries like Kenya and Zambia are getting very good at playing China off against the West.
Using that great power competition to their advantage.
Exactly. They can go to the IMF for one thing and to China for another, trying to get the best terms from both. Zambia even threatened to default in 2020, which gave them more leverage in the restructuring talks. They're learning to exploit the system's weaknesses.
So to wrap this all up, deconstruction shows us that all those simple binaries we started with, aid versus exploitation, West versus China, they collapse.
They really do. The system's core logic of accumulation is still there. But hegemony isn't just in Washington or Beijing anymore. It's spread out across what the sources call multiple fluid power nodes.
The debt trap isn't this fixed, sealed thing. It's a network of relationships that's constantly being fought over and renegotiated.
And the local actors, the borrowing countries, have way more agency than they're given credit for.
Which leaves a really big question for you, our listener, to think about. Given that these countries can now play the great powers against each other, how is that going to change the global balance of power over the next decade? And maybe the even bigger question is, what would actually take to change the fundamental logic of surplus value transfer that's underpinned this whole system for 500 years?